I heard my son say, "Just take everything from her." And for a moment I thought the sound in my chest was my own heart cracking. They were in the kitchen, unaware that the hallway carried every word straight to where I stood, with my hand still on the staircase rail. I don't know what hurt more, the sentence itself, or how casually he said it, as if he were discussing groceries, not the life of the woman who had raised him. At 79, a person thinks she has seen every shape betrayal can take. Apparently, I was still learning. I stayed completely still, the way I used to when I worked night shifts at the hospital and had to steady my hands before stitching someone's trembling skin. That old instinct, to quiet myself so the world didn't break further, returned without my permission. My son, Andrew, laughed softly, a sound I used to love when he was little. Then his wife, Charlene, answered him with that smooth voice of hers. She won't even know. Just ease her into signing. People her age don't question things. People her age. I suppose she meant people like me. Fragile. Confused. Grateful for scraps of attention. Their voices blended with the clink of their wine glasses. They had poured themselves a drink. They were comfortable. Planning. I stepped back from the railing, careful not to let the old floorboards creak. Not because I feared them. I feared my own voice if they heard me. I didn't trust it not to shake. It has always been my weakness. I speak quietly until pushed too far, and then the words come out too raw, too honest. And today, I didn't want honesty to spill from me. Not yet. They kept talking. Charlene went on about paperwork, about how it made sense to transfer the house now, before things get complicated later. I knew what she meant. She had been hinting for months, with that syrupy concern she wore like perfume, always too sweet, always artificial. Andrew didn't bother with sweetness. He wanted access to my accounts. He wasn't ashamed of wanting it. That part, strangely, I respected more than her pretense. My hands were cold, though the house was warm, and my mind, oh, it was painfully clear. You might expect shock to be disorienting, but no. It sharpened everything. I could see the dust on the hallway table, the crook in the carpet that George always promised he'd fix, the faint reflection of myself in the glass frame. An old woman in a soft gray cardigan, hair pulled back neatly, eyes that looked more tired than surprised. Because the truth was, something in me had known this day might come. Andrew's voice dropped lower. Once she signs, we're done worrying. Just take everything from her. That sentence returned, heavy, deliberate. And then their footsteps moved toward the back door, laughing about dinner reservations. My son didn't check on me before leaving. Charlene didn't call out a goodbye. The door shut, and their car engine hummed away. I exhaled only when I heard the quiet settle. I walked into the living room, lowering myself into my old chair. The cushion had molded to my shape long ago. I folded my hands on my lap, letting my breathing even out. The house felt different now, not smaller, not emptier, simply honest. Everything in it belonged to me, not to them. They had no idea how literal that truth already was. 6 months ago, after a night when I couldn't sleep and lay awake thinking about the way Andrew's tone had changed over the years, I moved every asset I had into a trust managed by Benson, my late husband's friend. The house, too. Every account, every share, every certificate. My name was still on everything, but not in a way anyone could touch. Not Andrew, not Charlene. Their hands would close on nothing. I sat there in the fading light, listening to the quiet tick of the clock on the mantel. I felt no triumph, no vengeance, only a tired sort of clarity. A woman my age is expected to fade, to yield, to hand over her life while smiling politely. But I have lived too long and lost too much to hand myself over for the convenience of others. The evening breeze moved the curtains slightly, brushing my cheek like an old friend reminding me I was still here. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself just sit and breathe and remain silent in a house that, despite everyone's plans, still belonged entirely to me. The morning after their conversation, I moved through my house the way one moves through a museum of their own life, slowly, touching nothing, noticing everything. The kettle rattled faintly when it boiled, as if echoing the tremor in my hands. I wasn't frightened. Fear is for younger people who still believe they can lose something vital. What I felt was quieter, heavier, like a stone laid gently on my chest. I'd lived long enough to know the difference between pain and clarity. This was clarity. Andrew and Charlene had always visited irregularly, but lately their visits carried a different heaviness, the kind that settles into a room even before anyone speaks. The last 3 Saturdays, they'd arrived with the same bright, strained smiles. Charlene always brought a store-bought cake, placed it on the table as if offering tribute, and then started surveying the house with that restless gaze, checking for signs of decline, as she called it. I don't decline. I simply age. There's a difference she never cared to understand. "Your hallway light flickers," she had said last week, tapping the switch as if I were too feeble to notice it myself. Andrew thinks it might be time to think about arrangements. Arrangements. She used that word often. It sounded like something you say before a funeral, not to a living woman who still walks her garden every morning. Andrew always sat opposite me at the kitchen table, where George used to read the newspaper. He'd lean forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. His posture was meant to look earnest. It used to work when he was a boy, when he wanted a toy, or permission to stay out past curfew. Now it only looked rehearsed. "Mom," he said last time, "we just want to help. You don't need the stress of managing everything alone." He said it softly, but his eyes flicked toward Charlene, seeking approval. He used to look at me like that, when he needed courage. Now he looked at her. I poured tea for them that day, the same way I always did, though the cups felt heavier in my hands. Charlene took a sip and gave a little sympathetic grimace, the kind people give when they want to suggest something better without seeming unkind. "You should let me reorganize your pantry," she'd said. "It's outdated." She meant it the same way she meant everything, a criticism disguised as concern. But I nodded politely, as I always do. Women my age learn to choose silence over unnecessary explanations. Silence, after all, reveals more truth than arguments ever can. They left that afternoon without noticing the strain in my shoulders or how slowly I walked them to the door. They didn't ask about my week or whether I'd finally fixed the leaky faucet. They didn't ask about my sleep, which had been broken for months. They glanced at the clock more often than they glanced at my face. Later that night, I opened a tin of shortbread cookies, ones I used to bake myself before my hands stiffened, and I ate one slowly, studying its crumble. There was a time when Andrew would have eaten half the box before dinner. He used to come home from school, dusty and loud, dropping his backpack at the door and calling for me before the bag even hit the floor. "Mom, I'm starving," he'd shout, though he never truly was, and I'd laugh, telling him that boys who grow like weeds need constant feeding. Those memories feel like they belong to someone else now, someone who didn't know how far affection could drift. I began noticing other small things in the days that followed. Andrew's texts were brief, clipped, utilitarian. Call me when you can. We need to talk. Let's handle paperwork this week. No warmth, no stories, no updates about his life unless they involved money, property, or my supposed well-being. I stopped replying quickly. I let messages sit until the evening light softened the room enough that I could read them without irritation. The neighbors say Andrew is a devoted son. They see him arrive in his clean car, carrying grocery bags Charlene filled at the store, and assume devotion. They don't see the way he checks the fridge afterward, removing the items he thinks I don't need: fresh berries, good cheese, anything that feels too enjoyable. They don't hear the way Charlene whispers, "She shouldn't waste money," as if pleasure were wasteful. I once overheard them in the yard, long before last night's conversation. I was watering my roses. They thought I couldn't hear through the open window. Charlene said, "She won't last alone much longer. We should be proactive." Andrew replied, "Mom is stubborn. We need to guide her." Guide, not help. That word returned to me now like a pebble pressed into my palm. Small, but sharp. I walked through the living room and paused by the piano. My fingers hovered over the keys but didn't press. My hands aren't steady enough anymore, but sometimes I like to pretend. I touched the lid gently. Dust gathered in the corners. Life gathers dust too, if you aren't careful. Their disrespect wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like water wearing down stone. But what they didn't understand, what they still didn't understand, is that stone doesn't disappear. It reshapes. The clock ticked in its steady rhythm, the same one George set up 40 years ago. It reminded me that time hasn't taken everything from me. Some things I still own completely: my thoughts, my choices, my boundaries, and the quiet, watchful part of me that has always known when something unfolding is not just unpleasant, but dangerous. By afternoon, I found myself sitting again in the same chair where I had listened to the fading echo of their voices the night before. And for the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt something unfamiliar rise inside me. Not fear, not sadness. A slow, steady resolve. On Tuesday afternoon, Andrew arrived alone. That in itself was unusual. He rarely came without Charlene unless something needed to be handled quickly, like replacing a broken heater or picking up documents he'd left behind. He walked into the house with the same purposeful stride he used when he was young and wanted to prove he wasn't afraid of the basement after dark. Only now the determination wasn't innocent. It was calculated. "Mom," he said, leaning in for a quick kiss that barely touched my cheek. "We need to talk about something important." He didn't remove his coat. That told me he wasn't planning to stay long, only long enough to accomplish a task. I motioned him to the kitchen, though my knees already ached from standing too long. He sat at the table, and I noticed he kept glancing at the door as if expecting Charlene to burst in with reinforcements. He took out a neat folder, the kind bankers carry, its edges too crisp, too new. "Charlene and I have been discussing your situation," he began. "My situation. It always amuses me when grown children speak to their parents as if they were managers reviewing employee performance. We think it's time to make things simpler for you." "Is that so?" I asked softly, taking my time as I filled the kettle. "Yes," he continued, encouraged by my calm. "You have too much to handle alone, The bills, the house, your investments. It's a lot at your age. At my age. A phrase people use when they want to sound compassionate while making you feel obsolete. He opened the folder and slid a stack of papers toward me. Power of attorney, he said. Just routine. It would allow me to help with decisions if something happens. You know, medical emergencies, financial confusion, that kind of thing. I looked at the papers but didn't touch them. The text blurred slightly. Not because I couldn't read it, but because I'd already read it months ago when Benson and I discussed every possible loophole and shield. Andrew didn't know that signing those papers would do nothing. He also didn't know that I wouldn't sign them. Not now, not ever. You don't have to decide today, he added quickly, probably afraid he'd rushed me. Just look it over. It's for your own good. You can't keep doing everything yourself forever. He said it kindly. And maybe, in his mind, it truly was kindness, in the same way someone might smile gently while taking a toy from an elderly woman's trembling hands, because they think she can't be trusted to hold it. Andrew thinks of himself as responsible. That's the saddest part. The kettle whistled. I poured hot water into the teapot, the steam warming my face. My hands didn't shake, not even a little. He mistook that for hesitation. Mom, he said, lowering his voice, we're trying to prevent problems before they happen. What if you fall? What if you're hospitalized? What if the bank calls about something you don't understand? I stirred the tea leaves, letting their scent rise. I've understood my finances for nearly 50 years, I reminded him gently. Your father and I built our life carefully. I manage what I have just fine. He smiled the way people smile at stubborn children. I know you think that, but we're just trying to help. Trying to help themselves, though he couldn't see that truth through his own self-importance. I set a cup in front of him. He didn't drink it. He pushed the documents slightly closer, tapping them with his finger as if urging the papers themselves to convince me. It's not complicated, he said. Just sign, and Charlene and I will take care of the rest. Charlene and I. 2 words spoken like a single entity. I sometimes wonder when exactly I lost my son, at what moment he handed the steering wheel of his life to someone else. Charlene was clever in her own way, but Andrew was willing. That made her influence easy. I picked up the top document, held it briefly, then laid it back down. I'll think about it, I said. The sentence was simple, unremarkable, but inside me, it settled with a quiet finality. He exhaled in relief. He thought he'd won the first step. Good, good. Take your time. But soon is better. You know how these things go. I nodded. Yes, I do. He didn't notice the meaning in my voice. He gathered the rest of his papers but left the folder on the table where I could review it. As he stood to leave, he kissed the top of my head like he used to when he had to rush somewhere but wanted to show he still cared. Then he walked out, satisfied with himself. The door closed. Silence stretched through the house again. I looked at the folder, its fresh edges, its promise of control. Then I picked it up, placed it in the drawer under the stove, out of sight, out of reach, and returned to the table with my cup of tea. The house was still, and for a long moment, I simply breathed. Let them plan, I thought. Let them believe they're orchestrating my life. Let them talk about arrangements and security and making things easier. They don't know I already made everything simple, just not in the way they imagine. When Andrew left that day, I stayed in the kitchen for a long while, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the old clock above the window. It was strange how silence could feel heavier after someone departed, as if the air itself held the shape of their intentions. I poured myself another cup of tea, not because I needed it, but because it gave my hands something to do. My thoughts were too restless to sit with empty palms. I walked through the house slowly, touching the tops of chairs, straightening picture frames that hadn't been crooked at all. Old habits. When you've lived somewhere for 40 years, every corner carries a memory, and sometimes memories arrive with more weight than comfort. The living room window, for example. George used to stand there in the evenings, watching the sky darken while he polished his reading glasses. He always insisted the sunset looked better through clean lenses. I stood there now, looking out the same window, and felt the familiar tug in my chest. 8 years, and I still felt him beside me in small, practical ways. Not in grand gestures, but in the way the house held his presence, the grooves in the wooden banister from his broad fingers, the faint scent of cedar in the closet from his old toolkit, even the worn leather cushion on his chair. I used to avoid that chair, afraid the sight of it would break me. But grief softens when you let it breathe. These days, it brings me steadiness more than sorrow. George would have hated what Andrew had become, not the ambition. George admired anyone with spine, but the entitlement. The way Andrew spoke to me lately, with that careful politeness that barely hides impatience, would have made George's jaw tighten. He didn't raise his voice often, but when he did, it was for dignity, his own or someone else's. "You don't shrink yourself for convenience, Miri," he told me once when we were newly married, and my mother-in-law had tried to explain all the ways a proper wife should behave. "If people need you smaller, it means they're afraid of you standing at full height." I remember laughing then. I was 23 and barely 5'2". Standing tall seemed a poetic phrase for other women, larger women, braver women, not me. But age reveals truths youth can't imagine. Even small women carry mountains inside them. I walked into George's old study. The room was dusty, but not neglected. I opened the curtains, letting the pale light spill across the floorboards. The desk was still neatly arranged, the last envelope he ever sealed still in the drawer, addressed to a cousin he never managed to visit. I ran my fingers along the edge of the desk and felt the familiar dip near the center, where he always rested his hand when he wrote. The truth is, losing him changed the landscape of my life in ways even I didn't understand at the time. I became quieter, more cautious. I didn't challenge Andrew when he started speaking to me with that clipped tone. I didn't object when Charlene suggested I stop driving at night, though I could still see just fine. I accepted their assumptions, not because I believed them, but because I didn't want to spend the little energy I had on conflict. But something inside me shifted again the night I overheard them. It was as if the timidity I'd built over the years cracked, revealing the firmer woman I had once been, the woman George knew, the woman who worked double shifts in the emergency ward, the woman who paid off a mortgage during a recession and nursed her husband through 2 surgeries without complaint. I had forgotten her, but she was still here. I closed the study door softly and walked down the hallway. My knees protested each step, but I ignored the ache. When I reached the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the quilt George's mother had sewn decades ago. The threads were fading, but the pattern was still strong, much like me, I supposed. On the nightstand lay a photograph of us on our 25th anniversary, George holding me close, my cheeks flushed with laughter. Andrew was in that picture too, grinning widely, his arm around my shoulder. I traced his younger face with a fingertip. Such a warm boy he had been. Thoughtful. Protective. If anyone had ever told me that he would one day speak of taking everything I have, I would have laughed at the absurdity. People change. Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. Sometimes because life hardens them, and sometimes because entitlement softens them in the wrong places. I don't know which happened to Andrew, but the result is the same. I lay back on the bed for a moment, letting my eyes close. The ceiling fan hummed softly above me. I thought about the folder he had left on the kitchen table, waiting for my signature. I thought about Charlene's bright, calculating eyes. And I thought about the legal documents locked in Benson's office. The trust, the amendments, the protections George would have insisted upon. I wasn't afraid of losing anything. That part of my life had already been secured. What unsettled me, what kept my breath from moving freely, was something simpler. The realization that my own son saw me as a stepping stone to comfort, a burden that needed managing, a door he was eager to unlock, not because he loved what was inside, but because he wanted to own it. For a long moment I stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet house. Then I sat up again, slowly, with a steadiness that came not from strength, but from resolve. The kind of resolve that grows in the bones of women who have outlived disappointment. Whatever happened next, I would meet it with the dignity George taught me, and the clarity my years had earned. Benson's office sits above an old bakery downtown, the kind that still uses real butter and closes before sunset. I've known that staircase for 30 years, the rails polished by the hands of people seeking advice, comfort, or rescue. I climbed it slowly, not from fear or exhaustion, but because I needed the quiet between steps to steady my thoughts. When you are 79, you learn that clarity often comes in the pauses, not in the decisions. The little bell above his door chimed as I entered. Benson looked up from his desk, glasses crooked on his nose, hair grayer than the last time I'd seen him. His suit jacket hung on the back of his chair, and he wore the same faded vest he claimed was lucky, though I suspect he simply liked its softness. He stood when he saw me. "Miri," he said, coming around the desk with the warmth of someone who remembers the sound of your younger voice. "You don't usually come without calling. Is everything all right?" I smiled at that, softly, but not convincingly. "Everything is underway," I answered. He motioned me to sit. The leather chair sighed under my weight, welcoming me like an old friend. I looked around the office, the shelves crowded with binders, the framed degrees, the window looking over the street where children carried brown paper bags from the bakery. All ordinary things, yet each felt sharper today, as if the world had lifted its veil and revealed its edges. Benson sat across from me, folding his hands. "Tell me what happened." I took a breath and told him, not every word, but enough. Andrew's voice at the kitchen door. Charlene's quiet encouragement. The documents. The assumption that I would simply hand my life to them like a neatly wrapped parcel. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I spoke the way nurses do when describing a wound that needs stitching. Calmly, clearly, without unnecessary emotion. Benson listened without interrupting, though his jaw tightened once, the way it used to when he and George played poker and someone cheated. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I know that's not enough, but I am." "I'm not here for apologies," I replied. "I want to confirm that everything we set up remains intact." He opened a locked drawer and pulled out a thick folder, my folder. my life in paper form. He placed his glasses more firmly on his nose and began flipping through the pages. I watched his eyes scan the documents, watched the small nod of satisfaction he gave every few seconds. "The trust is secure," he said. "Irrevocable, as we discussed. Your son has no legal path to it. Not through you, not through the courts. Access is restricted to you and me, and upon your passing, immediately transferred to your chosen beneficiary." "Lily," I said. My granddaughter's name felt like a warm stone in my hand, steady, grounding. She was the only one who still visited because she wanted to, not because she needed something. "Yes," Benson confirmed. "Lily," he continued. "The house title remains in the trust as well. Even if Andrew got you to sign anything, it wouldn't grant him actual ownership. Your accounts are protected. Medical decisions remain yours. Financial authority is yours. Everything is exactly as you arranged months ago." I nodded slowly. Relief wasn't the right word. I had known the truth already. This was confirmation, not revelation. But hearing it aloud steadied me. Benson closed the folder. "May I ask what changed? You were prepared for the possibility, but not certain it would happen." I looked out the window for a moment. The smell of fresh bread drifted up from the bakery below. Life always has a way of continuing, even when you feel it should pause out of respect. "I heard Andrew," I said quietly. I heard the way he said it. Take everything from her. Like I was already gone. Like I'd never existed except as a resource. I suppose hearing your child speak that way makes something inside you settle. Hard, but steady. Benson was silent. He understood grief, but he also understood dignity. In all the years I'd known him, he never confused the two. "What do you want to do now?" he finally asked. "I want to continue as planned," I said. Quietly, calmly, without drama. They will keep pushing, I know that. And I don't want to fight them. I want to outlast them. He smiled a little. "That, Miri, you can do." We went over the details again. My signatures, the clauses Andrew could never undo, the carefully constructed barriers that protected me even from my own vulnerability. Benson handed me copies of what I needed and tucked the originals back into the drawer. As I stood to leave, he touched my arm gently. "If things get worse, or if he becomes aggressive, call me. I mean it." I nodded. "I will." But I knew I wouldn't. Some battles are too small for lawyers and too large for words. On the walk down the staircase, my knees protested, but my spine felt strangely straight. The bakery door opened as I passed, and a child came running out with a warm loaf wrapped in paper. His laughter echoed down the street. For a moment, I let it wash over me, an unexpected balm. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I simply felt prepared. And preparation, I've learned with age, is its own kind of power. Thursday began with the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. A persistent trembling, like a moth trapped beneath glass. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Andrew had developed a habit of calling early, as if catching me before my morning tea would somehow soften my resolve. I let the phone ring until it stopped. Silence is a language I've learned to use only in my later years, but it speaks clearly when I allow it. I dressed slowly, my joints resisting the way old hinges do when someone opens a forgotten door. The mirror showed me the same familiar woman, white hair pinned back neatly, faint shadows beneath the eyes, shoulders straighter than one would expect at 79. I didn't feel weak. I simply felt watched. Not by anyone in the room, but by the version of myself I used to be, the one who would have said yes out of habit. In the kitchen, I boiled water and set out a slice of toast. But the quiet didn't last long. At 9:07, there was a knock, 3 short taps, followed by a longer pause. Andrew. Only he knocked like that, as if reminding me he still knew the rhythms of the house he grew up in. I opened the door because avoiding him forever wasn't realistic, and because I preferred to choose the battleground myself. He entered with a rush of cool air and practiced enthusiasm. "Mom," he exclaimed, though his eyes were scanning the hallway again, searching for signs that age had somehow rearranged my world overnight. I tried calling. "You must have been asleep." "I was awake," I said simply. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, quick but noticeable. He didn't like it when I steered conversations away from his assumptions. He followed me into the kitchen, already loosening his jacket as if preparing for negotiation. "I brought the papers again," he said, placing the folder on the table with an overly confident thump. "I thought maybe we could go through them together. Sometimes things make more sense when someone explains them." He was using a tone I recognized from my years in the hospital, a tone nurses use for patients who are confused or frightened. It unsettled me not because he used it, but because he believed it appropriate. "I've read them," I answered. "But you haven't signed," he said, pulling out a chair for himself. "There's no pressure, Mom. But it really would make things easier for all of us. You wouldn't have to stress about bills or decisions. Charlene and I can take that burden." Burden. The word sat between us like something rotten. I didn't show anything in my face. "Tea?" I asked instead. He blinked, surprised at my refusal to rise to the moment he had prepared for. "Sure," he muttered, though he rarely drank tea with me anymore. I filled the kettle. The familiar whistle steadied me, a reminder that some things in my life still responded predictably. Andrew opened the folder again, pushing one document toward me. "This one authorizes me to communicate with your bank. Just routine. They often require a representative for older clients." Older clients. My fingers hovered over the paper, not touching it. It wasn't anger that kept my hand still. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes from knowing a person might believe his intentions are noble, even when they are self-serving. "You think I can't manage a conversation with my own bank?" I asked quietly. He laughed, too quickly. No, that's not what I'm saying. It's just, well, they can be complicated. Charlene handles a lot of our finances. She's good at it." I thought of Charlene's sharp gaze, the way she assessed every corner of my kitchen as though she were cataloging assets. Yes, she was good at it. I sat down, folding my hands on the table. "Andrew," I said softly, "why do you need access to my accounts?" He blinked again, taken aback by the direct question. "I don't need it," he insisted. "It's just practical. If something happened to you, we'd have to sort through everything without guidance. This is just smart planning." Smart planning. He didn't realize the irony. The kettle whistled, loud and shrill. I poured the water, watching the tea swirl into amber ribbons. Andrew tapped the papers impatiently. "You're overthinking it," he said. "This is for your protection." Ah, yes, protection. Always the word used by those who want control. I looked at the documents, then gently closed the folder. I said, "I'll think about it." He exhaled, frustrated this time. Not enough to raise his voice, but enough to reveal the crack in his patience. "Mom, we can't keep delaying. These decisions should be made sooner rather than later." "I understand," I replied, folding the folder shut. "And I'm not making them today." His jaw tightened, the way it did when he encountered a problem he hadn't anticipated. "Charlene's going to ask me about this," he murmured, as if that were my responsibility. "This isn't her decision," I said quietly. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a brief moment, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Uncertainty. As if he suddenly realized I wasn't bending. He stood abruptly, gathering his jacket. "Fine," he muttered. "I guess we'll talk again this weekend, but we shouldn't wait much longer." He left without finishing his tea. After the door closed, I sat alone in the kitchen, the folder still resting beneath my palm. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt. I was simply aware of the widening gap between who Andrew used to be and who he had let himself become. And as the tea cooled beside me, I understood something clearly. He believed I was wavering, but I was not. I was preparing. Charlene arrived the next afternoon without warning, the way people do when they want the element of surprise on their side. I saw her through the kitchen window, walking briskly, carrying a paper bag as though she were bringing comfort, not an agenda. She knocked lightly, almost daintily, pretending she didn't expect to be invited in. I opened the door anyway. I was raised to be polite, even to people who sharpen their kindness like a tool. "Miriam," she said warmly, stepping inside before I'd even moved aside. "I thought you might like some soup. I made too much last night." I doubted she had made anything. The container was from a deli 2 streets over, but I smiled a little. How thoughtful. She placed the bag on the counter and looked around my kitchen in that way she always did. Subtle, quick, judging the tidiness, the appliances, the signs of age she hoped to find. Her gaze lingered on the small stack of mail near the toaster. I watched her eyes try to read the return addresses. "How are you feeling these days?" she asked, lowering her voice into something soft and syrupy. "Andrew said you seemed overwhelmed." I sat at the table. "Did he?" She took the seat across from me, folding her hands in a way meant to appear gentle. "We just want to make sure you're taken care of. It's not easy managing a house alone at your age." There it was, the phrase people like her deliver with a sweet smile and a poisoned edge. At your age. As if those 3 words were enough to undo everything I'd ever accomplished. "I manage," I said simply. "Oh, I know you try," she replied, tilting her head as though giving me credit for effort. "But the world is different now. Bills, fraud, paperwork. It's a lot. And Andrew worries constantly. He barely sleeps." That was a lie. Andrew sleeps well. Too well for someone who claims to be plagued with concern. But Charlene watched my face closely, searching for doubt, for guilt, for the softness she hoped would give way under pressure. She reached into her purse and pulled out the same folder Andrew had shown me. "I know he brought these by. Maybe I can explain them better. Woman to woman. Woman to woman." She said it as though we shared something intimate, something loyal. But loyalty requires honesty, and she had offered none. She opened the folder, sliding a few pages forward. "This one lets Andrew help with your accounts. Only help, not control. You keep ownership, of course." I looked down at the papers without touching them. "I'm not signing anything today." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. Then she smoothed it away. "Oh, of course, of course. I didn't mean today. It's just, these things take time, and if something happened—" "Nothing has happened," I said calmly, "and nothing is going to." She forced a gentle smile. "You never know. My mother fell last year, you remember? And it was chaos. We had to sort everything ourselves. I'd hate for Andrew to go through that with you. I let her words settle between us. She wanted fear to do the work for her. Fear of falling. Fear of illness. Fear of becoming a burden. I wasn't unfamiliar with those fears, but I didn't live by them. I met her eyes. Charlene, what worries you more? Something happening to me, or not having access to what I own? Her lips parted, just slightly, like someone caught in a doorway they didn't expect to reveal anything. Miriam, she whispered, that's a hurtful question. It wasn't, and she knew it. But she was skilled at using emotion as a shield. She rose to her feet, gathering the papers with a quiet sigh. I think you're taking this the wrong way. We only want to make life easier. For whom? I asked. She didn't answer. Not directly. She slipped the folder back into her purse and smoothed her hair. Just think about it. We're trying so hard to help. She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. It would mean a lot to Andrew. I nodded once, giving her nothing more, and she left with the same brisk steps she'd arrived with. When the house settled into silence again, I poured myself a cup of tea. The soup sat untouched on the counter. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel disappointed. What I felt was something simpler, quieter, an understanding. They were accelerating, which meant the moment to push back in my own quiet way was drawing near. And I was ready. Andrew came by on Sunday evening, unannounced again, though by now I'd stopped expecting courtesy. The sun was already low, turning the living room walls a muted gold, the color George used to call forgiving light. I was knitting a blanket for Lily. Slow work these days, but steady. And I didn't bother setting it aside when Andrew walked in. If he intended to catch me unprepared, he would be disappointed. Mom, he said sharply, not even pretending this was a social visit. We need to talk. I nodded toward the armchair across from me. Then sit. He didn't. Instead, he paced, rubbing the back of his neck in that agitated way he'd had since adolescence, though back then his worries were things like whether he'd pass algebra. Now they were about access and ownership. You spoke with Charlene, he said. She told me how the conversation went. I kept knitting. Did she? He stopped moving long enough to look at me. Mom, why are you being so difficult about this? We're trying to help you, but you're treating us like we're the enemy. I lifted my eyes to him, slowly, deliberately. You asked me for control of everything I have, I said softly. That isn't help. That's authority. He let out a frustrated sound. It's support. You're the one making it complicated. At your age, I set the knitting needles down, not loudly, just enough that the quiet of the room shifted. At my age, I repeated. His jaw tightened. Mom, you know what I mean. You can't keep up with all of this. It's too much for you. You need someone reliable to step in, someone who actually cares about your well-being. Someone like you, I said. Yes, he snapped. Exactly like me. It was the first honest sentence he'd spoken in weeks. I watched him, noting the impatience in his posture, the way he kept glancing at his phone on the table as if Charlene were waiting for updates. He wasn't here to understand. He was here to pressure, and he didn't even hide it well. You're creating problems where there don't need to be any, he said. You're acting paranoid. We just want to make sure everything is handled before anything happens. Before I die, I supplied quietly. He flinched, not because the idea upset him, but because he didn't like hearing it framed so plainly. I didn't say that. But you meant it. Silence settled between us. Heavy. honest. He took a deep breath as though gathering himself for a final push. Mom, listen. If you keep resisting, you're going to make things harder for everyone. We need access to the house information, your bank contacts, the investment accounts. You need access, I corrected. He shook his head, and there, beneath the frustration, I saw something else. Desperation. That unsettled me more than his anger. What is happening, Andrew? I asked softly. Why now? Why this urgency? He didn't answer. He looked away, jaw working, eyes darting toward the window as if searching for an exit. Whatever had been pushing him forward, he wasn't ready to name it. I leaned back in my chair. You talk about my life as if it's an administrative inconvenience, I said. You talk about me as though I'm not in the room, as though you're already planning for a future without me. I'm trying to secure that future, he snapped. For all of us. Do you think I enjoy these conversations? Do you think Charlene does? We're doing the responsible thing because you won't. I felt a shift inside me then, small but unmistakable. A quiet boundary settling into place. Something that had been loose now held firm. Andrew, I said, I am managing my life just fine. He laughed, but it wasn't cruelty. It was disbelief. You think you are, Mom, but you're not. Look at this place. Look at all the mail you haven't sorted. Look at how you move. You're tired. You're slow. Getting old is not incompetence, I said quietly. He ignored that. If I don't step in, who will? I will, I replied. He stared at me, really stared, as if seeing me for the first time in years, or perhaps as if seeing that I wasn't folding the way he had counted on. You're making a mistake, he said finally. No, I answered. I'm stopping one. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked around the room, at the furniture he once climbed on as a child, at the pictures of a family we used to be, at the quiet house that refused to bend to his urgency. This isn't over, he muttered, grabbing his coat. I never said it was, I replied. He left without another word. After the door shut, I picked up my knitting again. My hands were steady. The house was still. Outside, the evening light softened into that gentle shade George used to admire. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't shaken. I was simply aware that something essential had shifted. Andrew wanted control. But I had finally taken back my voice. And that, I realized, was the beginning of the real change. Lily arrived on Wednesday evening, just after sunset, carrying a small bag of groceries and a smile that didn't ask anything of me. She always knocked gently, as though she were entering a chapel, not her grandmother's kitchen. When I opened the door, she wrapped her arms around me with a warmth that settled directly into my ribs. You look tired, Grandma, she said softly. Are you sleeping? I brushed a loose lock of hair from her forehead. I sleep enough. Come in, sweetheart. She set the groceries on the counter, fresh strawberries, my favorite, and a loaf of rye bread. Things chosen with care, not obligation. She moved around the kitchen easily, knowing where I kept the kettle and the mugs without needing to ask. When her mother died, she spent 3 months here, and somehow she still remembers the shape of my drawers better than Andrew ever did. How's school? I asked. Oh, exhausting, but good. She paused, then added with a shy grin. I got an A on my project, the one about aging and independence. I smiled. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. We sat at the table, tea between us. The room felt lighter with her in it, as though the walls themselves recognized her kindness. Lily doesn't fill silence with noise. She fills it with presence. and presence is rarer than anyone admits. After a few minutes, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Dad seems stressed," she said carefully. "He mentioned you weren't agreeing on some things. I didn't want to pry, but I'm worried." Her concern was genuine. I felt it through her fingertips, warm against my skin. I took a slow breath. I didn't want to burden her, but I also didn't want to lie. Not to the one person who still treated me like someone whose thoughts mattered. "Your father and Charlene want access to my affairs," I said gently. "They believe it's time I hand things over." Lily's expression tightened, not with surprise, but with disappointment. "He's being pushy, isn't he? He does that when he thinks he's right." "When he thinks he deserves something," I corrected softly. She looked down, thumb rubbing small circles against the back of my hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You don't deserve that." No, I thought. But life doesn't hand you what you deserve. It hands you people, and you learn who they are by how they hold you when you falter, or how quickly they let go. I studied her face. She had her mother's eyes, soft, deep-set, full of quiet questions. Sometimes I worry she sees too much. Sometimes I worry she sees exactly enough. "Lily," I said slowly, "has your father talked to you about my house? Or anything I own?" She hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Then she nodded. "Not directly. But I've heard him and Charlene mention planning ahead. And once he asked if I knew whether you kept important documents somewhere obvious." I exhaled softly. So he was widening his circle, testing the borders. I squeezed her hand lightly. "You didn't tell him anything." "Of course not," she said, almost offended. "Grandma, I'm not stupid." No, she wasn't. She had more clarity at 21 than some people had after a lifetime. I let the silence rest between us for a while. She sipped her tea. I watched the way her shoulders relaxed in this old kitchen, as if she knew she didn't have to pretend here. Finally, she looked up. "Are you scared?" The question surprised me, not because it was bold, but because it was honest in a way few people allow themselves to be. "I'm tired," I replied. "But fear?" I shook my head. "No. I'm done with fear." She nodded slowly, absorbing that. Then she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "If you ever need me, anything at all, you call me first. Don't let Dad pressure you. Promise me." I smiled, a small, aching smile. "I promise." She stayed another hour, telling me stories from campus. Her roommate's terrible cooking, a boy who kept trying to impress her by pretending he understood poetry. I laughed more than I expected to. When she finally stood to leave, she kissed my cheek. "You're still the strongest person I know," she murmured. "Even when you think you're not." After she left, the house felt quieter, but not empty. Her presence lingered like warmth in a room after a fire has burned low. For the first time in days, I felt something close to peace. Because someone still saw me. Not as an asset, not as a burden, but as myself. They arrived together this time, Andrew and Charlene, just before noon on Saturday, carrying the kind of determined energy people usually reserve for unpleasant tasks they're eager to finish. I had just finished washing the breakfast dishes when their car pulled into the driveway. I dried my hands slowly, watching them through the window. Charlene was speaking quickly, her gestures sharp. Andrew nodded stiffly, already bracing himself. They didn't ring the bell. Andrew opened the door with the spare key I'd given him years ago, back when trust between us still felt natural. I watched them step inside, and for a brief second, I wondered if he even remembered the conversation we'd had the day he'd earned that key, how he promised never to enter without asking. He had been 17 then, proud of being treated like an adult. "Mom?" he called, his voice forced light. "We're here." I didn't answer immediately. I gave myself a moment, just a quiet breath, before stepping into the hallway. "I see that," I said. Charlene was the first to smile. It was too bright, too polished. "We thought we'd stop by and go over the documents again. Maybe explain them better. Sometimes things make more sense the second time." I looked at her coat still buttoned to the top. She didn't intend to stay long, only to accomplish something. Andrew held the folder like a shield. "Let's just sit and review everything. It won't take much time." I walked into the living room and sat in the armchair George used to favor. They followed. Andrew sat forward, elbows on his knees, while Charlene perched on the edge of the sofa as if maintaining perfect posture might give her moral authority. "Mom," Andrew began too quickly, "you know this is all for your benefit. The sooner things are in place, the more secure you'll be. These decisions shouldn't be left until it's too late." "I didn't realize it was too late," I said softly. He blinked, irritated. "That's not what I meant." Charlene stepped in before he could continue. "We're just trying to prepare. It's responsible. And we want to make sure nothing slips through the cracks. You'd be shocked how often older adults get taken advantage of." "Older adults," I repeated, as though tasting the phrase. She didn't catch the tone. "Yes, exactly. Predatory scams, bad decisions, confusion." "I'm not confused," I said. She paused. Her smile flickered. "No, of course not. But these things can happen quickly. That's why we're offering to help." Offering. As though it were a gift. Andrew opened the folder, spreading the pages across the coffee table with practiced confidence. "This one," he said, tapping the top sheet, "just lets us manage your accounts. Nothing major. You'd still be the owner. We'd just handle the day-to-day. And this one," Charlene added, sliding another forward, "authorizes us to communicate with your lawyer if needed. You know, emergencies, paperwork. Those things can be overwhelming." I picked up the second page, not to read it, though I did let my eyes rest on the text long enough to satisfy them, but to feel the weight of the paper. It was thicker than necessary, official enough to intimidate someone who feared making a mistake. "You've already signed similar documents for your medical care," Andrew said. "This is no different." It was entirely different, of course. My medical directives had been written by me, for me, and witnessed by someone who knew the law, not by someone who wanted my house. I set the page down. "And why?" I asked quietly. "Must this be done now?" They exchanged a look, a brief, sharp one, the kind of look people share when they've rehearsed an answer. "Because it's time," Andrew said. "You're not the same as you were 10 years ago, or even 5. "And you think that means I should hand everything over?" "I think," he said carefully, "that it would prevent complications." "Complications for whom?" His jaw tightened again. "Mom, don't do this." "I'm only asking," I said. "It's a simple question." Charlene sighed dramatically. "This is becoming difficult. We're trying to do the responsible thing, and you're acting like we're attacking you." "Are you not?" I asked, still calm. They both froze. It wasn't the volume. My voice had been soft. It was the clarity. They hadn't expected clarity. Andrew stood abruptly. "I can't talk to you when you're like this." "When I'm like what?" I asked. "Suspicious," he snapped. "Stubborn. Irrational. Stubborn. Irrational. Words used for women whose compliance can no longer be counted on. I folded my hands in my lap. I will not be signing anything today. Mom, or tomorrow, I added. Charlene exhaled sharply. This is unbelievable. They gathered their things in tight, frustrated movements. Andrew didn't look at me as he left. When the door finally closed, I sat there for a long while, staring at the papers they had forgotten to take, left scattered on the table like fallen leaves. Not once did my hands shake. Not once did I doubt myself. What they didn't understand, what they still refused to see, was that I wasn't resisting out of fear. I was resisting because I finally remembered how to stand. I didn't expect him to try the bank so soon, but people reveal themselves most clearly when they feel time slipping out of their hands. Andrew had left my house frustrated, almost vibrating with the need to regain control, and I knew that kind of energy never settles quietly. It spills. It reaches for shortcuts. It reaches for doors that aren't open. 2 days later, the phone rang just as I was trimming dried stems from my geraniums. The number on the screen wasn't familiar, but the tone of the woman's voice was unmistakably professional. Mrs. Harper, this is Elaine from First Maple Bank. I'm calling to confirm whether you authorized your son to inquire about your private accounts this morning. The pruning shears paused in my hand. A small leaf fell onto the table. No, I said, keeping my voice even. I did not authorize anyone. There was a short silence, the kind that tells more than words. Thank you, she said carefully. We denied the request, of course. We just wanted to alert you. He was persistent. Persistent. That was their polite way of saying he had pushed. Hard. After the call ended, I stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment, palms resting flat on the laminate. The room felt still, too still, as though even the appliances were holding their breath. I wasn't surprised. A mother knows her child's patterns, even when those patterns turn into something sharp. What surprised me was the faint ache behind my ribs. Not hurt, not betrayal, but something older. Recognition. I had once believed that Andrew's impatience came from stress, that his sharp tone came from exhaustion, that his controlling nature came from wanting to feel capable. But now I saw intention where I once saw struggle. An hour later, the doorbell rang, and there he was. Andrew stood on the porch with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, shoulders hunched in a way that suggested he was already preparing for an argument. His eyes darted around me as though he expected to see a lawyer standing in my living room. "Mom," he said, forcing a breath. "We need to talk." "Come in," I replied, though he didn't deserve the gentleness in my tone. He stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind him. "Why did the bank say you haven't authorized me? I told them I'm your son." I told them it was important. "It wasn't true," I said. "That's why they didn't authorize you." He let out a harsh laugh. "You're being ridiculous. I wasn't trying to do anything wrong. I just needed information." "You needed access," I corrected. "There's a difference." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Mom, listen to me carefully. If something were to happen to you, anything, I need to be prepared. I can't be blindsided. I have responsibilities." "Responsibilities to whom?" I asked. He hesitated. That split-second pause was the most honest thing he'd offered me in months. "To my family," he finally said. "To my future. To making sure nothing falls apart." There it was. Not my security. Not my comfort. His stability. "And you believe my accounts are part of that future?" I said. His mouth tightened. Don't twist my words. I'm not twisting anything, I answered softly. I'm acknowledging what you've made clear. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing like he had in my living room the week before. You're being stubborn. You're letting your imagination run away with you. Charlene and I are trying to help you, but you're acting like we're thieves. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I had not called him that, not once, but he had chosen it anyway. I'm acting, I said gently, like someone who heard her son say, just take everything from her. He froze. Color drained from his face in a way I had never seen, not even when he broke his arm at 11 or when he totaled his first car. This was a different kind of pain, the pain of being caught. You misunderstood, he whispered. I heard, I replied. He swallowed, jaw tightening again. Mom, you're making a mess out of nothing. If you would just sign the papers. I will not. His eyes flashed, not with grief, but with something harsher, something like entitlement cracking open. You're going to regret this, he said quietly. I doubt it, I answered. For a long moment we just stared at each other, the man who once held my hand crossing the street, and the woman he now saw as an obstacle. Then he left, slamming the door behind him. The house trembled for a moment, then settled. I returned to my geraniums. The damaged stems needed trimming, and I found myself cutting them cleanly, without hesitation. Some things must be removed before they destroy what's still capable of growing. The family gathering was Charlene's idea, which meant it was never meant to be gentle. She called it a check-in dinner, as if concerns could be softened by dressing them in polite terms. I knew what it was the moment I stepped into their house, the way their voices dropped when I walked in, the way Andrew cleared the table too quickly, as if removing distractions before the real conversation began. Lily was there too, sitting quietly on the far end of the sofa, sensing the tension before a word was spoken. Her eyes flicked to mine, asking silently if I was all right. I gave her a small nod. Charlene started with her version of kindness. Miriam, we've all been worried about you. Things have been strained lately, and we thought maybe if we talked openly, we could avoid misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. People like her always choose that word when they don't want to admit wrongdoing. Andrew sat stiffly beside her, shoulders squared, as if preparing for a negotiation. Mom, he said, this has gone far enough. You need to stop treating us like adversaries. Everything we're asking for is reasonable. And necessary, Charlene added. I sat in the armchair across from them, folding my hands in my lap. Explain to me, I said quietly, what exactly is necessary? They exchanged a glance, quick, nervous. Then Andrew took a breath. You can't continue managing everything alone. You've refused access, refused help, and now you're calling banks, blocking us, shutting us out. I didn't call the bank, I replied. The bank called me. That landed exactly where I expected. Andrew's face darkened, a shadow moving across his features. Charlene laid a hand on his arm as though steadying a small storm. Mom, you're blowing things out of proportion, he said. Look, it's simple. Sign the papers. Let me take care of things. This resistance isn't healthy. Healthy. What a curious word to describe someone protecting herself. I sat forward slightly, not confrontational, just present. Andrew, I said softly, you tried to access my accounts without permission. You pressured me. You pushed your way into conversations that were not yours. He opened his mouth, but I continued before he could interrupt. And you spoke about me as though I were no longer able to think, or choose, or live. The room fell very still. Charlene tried to salvage the moment. Miriam, you're emotional. This is why we worry. I turned my eyes to her, steady and unblinking. I am not emotional. I am finally speaking. That silenced even her. I felt Lily shift on the sofa, barely a movement, but supportive, like a hand pressed gently against my back. From this moment, I said, my voice low but unwavering, you will not raise this subject again. You will not pressure me for documents. You will not attempt to obtain information behind my back. I will manage my affairs. I will make my decisions. You have no role in them. Andrew stared at me, astonished, truly astonished, as though the mother he'd rewritten in his mind could not possibly speak with such certainty. You can't be serious, he whispered. I am, I said, and you will respect it. Charlene's lips tightened, resentment curling at the edges. You're making a mistake you can't undo. I rose slowly from my chair. No, I'm drawing a boundary you should have seen long before now. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Lily stood, quietly, firmly, and moved to my side. Grandma, she said softly, I'll walk you to the car. I nodded, grateful without showing it too openly. As we left the room, Andrew called after me, his voice strained and unfamiliar. This isn't over. I didn't turn back. Some things end the moment you finally say no. Andrew came the next morning, earlier than usual, too early for anything except confrontation. I heard the force in his knock before I reached the door. It wasn't a request, it was an announcement. When I opened it, he pushed past me without waiting, the way people do when they believe anger gives them permission. Mom, he said sharply, we're talking now. This can't wait. He stood in the middle of my living room, breathing hard, eyes darting like someone cornered. I closed the door behind us, not afraid, just aware. The house felt smaller with his agitation inside it. You humiliated me last night, he said, in front of my family, in front of Lily. I spoke the truth, I answered quietly. He shook his head, pacing. You're being manipulated. You're confused. You're not thinking straight. There it was again. The refrain he clung to because it excused everything. If I was confused, then he was justified. If I was irrational, then he was righteous. If I was slipping, then he was needed. I walked past him and sat in my chair. My hands rested lightly on the armrests. I am thinking very clearly, I said. Too clearly for your comfort. That struck him. His jaw clenched. You don't understand what you're risking. You're leaving everything vulnerable. You're leaving yourself vulnerable. No, I said softly. I'm simply refusing to hand my life to you. He stopped pacing and faced me fully. You don't get to say that. I'm your son. As if that word should absolve you, I murmured. He flinched, not visibly, but in the tightening of his shoulders. I've tried to be patient. I've tried to help. But you're acting paranoid. Signing those documents is the responsible thing. Why can't you see that? Because they serve you, I replied. Not me. His face reddened. Do you think I'm stealing from you? Is that it? You think I'm some kind of monster? No, I said after a pause. I think you are someone who wants ease, and you see me as the obstacle to it. He stared at me as though the room had suddenly shifted shape, as though he didn't recognize the woman sitting in front of him. You're wrong, he whispered. Then why go to the bank? I asked. Silence fell between us, long, heavy, undeniable. You had no right to do that, I continued. No cause, no permission. You acted because you believed you were entitled. That's not fair, he snapped. I had to know how complicated everything was. I had to know what I'm dealing with. You are dealing with my life, I said. And that is something you do not get to manage. His breath came faster. Frustration turned into something sharper, something that looked dangerously close to desperation. Mom, listen to me. You have no idea how much pressure I'm under. Charlene and I, our finances, things are tight. We're trying to plan a future that includes you. And if you don't cooperate, you're going to make everything harder. There it was at last, the crack in his carefully rehearsed concern. Not protection, not love, not fear for my well-being, financial need, dependence, expectation. I am not your solution, I said quietly. He closed his eyes as though the sentence physically struck him. When he opened them again, something had changed. The boy I raised, the one who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, was gone. Only the man remained, shaped by choices I had not been part of. You're being cruel, he said. You don't care what happens to us. I care, I replied, but I will not sacrifice myself to ease the consequences of your decisions. He stared at me for a long, trembling moment. Then he whispered, So that's it. That's it, I said. He turned, walked toward the door and paused with his hand on the knob. You're making a mistake you won't be able to fix. I shook my head gently. No, Andrew. I have already fixed it. He didn't answer. The door closed behind him with a soft finality, not slammed, not forced. Just closed. I sat back slowly, letting the quiet return to the house. The confrontation was over, but something deeper had ended long before he walked out that door. I had only now found the courage to name it. I woke the next morning without the usual heaviness in my chest. It wasn't joy, not at my age, and not after days like these, but a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. A clearing, as though the clutter of worry that had lived behind my ribs had finally been removed, leaving quiet space where clarity could breathe. The house was gentle in the early light. I made myself tea, added honey, and sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a stack of cream-colored stationery I had been saving for something meaningful. I realized, with a small exhale, that the moment had finally come. I began the letter to Andrew with his name. Just his name. No dear, no softening. It wasn't anger that withheld those things. It was truth. I wrote slowly, choosing each word the way a nurse chooses her steps in a dark room. Carefully, with intention. I told him I loved him, because that had always been true, even when love became quieter and less certain. I told him that his recent choices had changed the way we would move forward, that trust, once cracked, cannot be forced back into its shape, that respect must be mutual, or it cannot exist at all. I did not accuse. I did not list grievances like debts. Instead, I explained what would happen now. He would no longer have a key to my home. He would no longer be involved in my financial or legal matters. He would no longer pressure or question my decisions. Any future contact would be on my terms alone, calm, limited, and conditional on respect. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. It did not feel like punishment. It felt like closure. Next, I wrote a shorter letter, this one to Lily. She didn't need explanations. She didn't need apologies. I simply told her that she has always been a place of tenderness in my life, and that I had arranged things so she would be cared for in the future, not because she expected anything, but because she had given me something invaluable these past years: presence without demand. After sealing both envelopes, I dialed Benson. He answered on the second ring. "Everything all right, Miri?" "Yes," I said. "Very much. I'm ready to finalize the beneficiary update we discussed." "You're certain?" he asked gently. "I've been certain for a long time," I replied. I just needed to hear myself say it. He didn't congratulate me or encourage me. He understood that dignity is not something people cheer for. It's something they witness quietly. He scheduled the signing for the next day, and I hung up. I walked through the house then, room by room, letting my hands brush the furniture, the walls, the memories. Not with bitterness, not with mourning. Simply acknowledging what remained mine. My life, my choices, my peace. George's photograph sat on the windowsill, catching sunlight on its glass. I touched the edge of the frame. "You would have told me to do this sooner," I whispered. And I knew he would have. I placed Andrew's envelope by the door, ready to be mailed. Lily's I tucked into my purse. I preferred to give hers in person. Not because she needed reassurance, but because I wanted to look at her face and know she understood the softness behind my resolve. The house was silent again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt right-sized, like a garment that finally fits after years of hanging too loose. I sat on the couch, hands folded in my lap, and breathed deeply. The storm had passed. Now came the clearing. The next afternoon was bright, almost too bright for February, the kind of sunlight that makes even old wood floors look warm again. I sat on the back veranda with a blanket over my knees and a cup of chamomile tea cooling between my palms. The air held that gentle hush that comes after a storm, when everything is still, not because it's afraid to move, but because it no longer needs to. Andrew hadn't responded to my letter. I didn't expect him to. Silence was his way of retreating when he couldn't win. There was a time that silence would have hollowed me out with guilt, made me question my own judgment, pushed me to reconcile things that never should have been broken in the first place. But not now. Now it felt like distance, necessary, earned, almost merciful. He would be angry. He would justify his anger with stories he told himself about duty and fairness and disappointment. Maybe one day he would see the truth hidden beneath his own excuses. Maybe not. But that no longer belonged to me to fix. Motherhood teaches you many things, but the most painful lesson is this: you cannot save someone from the consequences of the life they choose to build. I watched the bare branches sway gently in the wind, and I thought about my younger self, the one who always spoke softly, who apologized even when she wasn't at fault, who believed that endurance was the same as love. I wondered what she would think of me now, an old woman sitting with certainty in her lap like a folded blanket. I liked to think she would be proud. Later that day, Lily came by. She didn't knock. She peeked through the open veranda door, smiling the way young people smile when they're relieved to find you exactly where they hoped you'd be. "Grandma," she said, stepping into the sunlight. "You look peaceful." "I am," I answered. And I meant it. She sat beside me, her shoulder brushing mine. "Dad's upset," she admitted, though gently, as if cushioning the words. "He won't say it, but he knows he crossed a line." I nodded. Some lines shouldn't be crossed, and once they are, they must be redrawn. She didn't try to soothe me. She didn't argue. She simply reached for my hand, her thumb brushing lightly against the back of my knuckles. I felt the warmth of her, a warmth that never asked, never took, never expected. I'm glad you protected yourself, she said quietly. I'm glad you chose you. I looked at her for a long moment. I chose dignity, I corrected softly. Sometimes they're the same thing. A bird landed on the railing, tilting its head as if listening. The breeze carried the scent of the cedar tree George planted 3 decades ago. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the heaviness of memory, only its steadiness, like a hand resting between my shoulder blades. Your life is still yours, Lily whispered. Yes, I said. It is. And that was the truth of it. Not triumphant, not loud, simply true. My life was mine again, not parceled out to the expectations of others, not diminished by their needs, not bent under their urgency. Just mine. As the sun dipped lower, I felt the edges of tiredness settle into my bones, but it wasn't the tiredness of worry. It was the tiredness of someone who had finally exhaled after holding her breath for too many years. Before Lily left, she hugged me tightly, her head resting near my shoulder. If you ever need help, she said softly, you only have to call me. I know, I replied, but needing help isn't the same as being taken. She nodded. She understood. After she drove away, I remained on the veranda until the sky turned pale lavender. The quiet around me felt like a second skin, familiar, comforting, wholly mine. In the distance, a single porch light flickered on, then steadied. I watched it glow, steady and unbothered. It reminded me of something George once told me, long before gray touched either of our hair. A person who stands in their own truth doesn't need to raise their voice. The world adjusts around them. I closed my eyes and let the evening settle. The world, at last, had adjusted. And if you've walked through anything like this yourself, if you've held your breath for years, or felt unseen, or carried the quiet weight of someone else's expectations, then stay with stories like these. They remind us that dignity is not loud, and victory is not always visible. If this story touched something in you, share it, save it, or leave a comment. Your voice may be the lantern someone else needs in their own quiet room.